But to begin, I want to introduce Greg Chipp. He is the Managing Director of Drug Policy Australia, the founder and Managing Director, been actively involved in politics and public policy for several decades. He's initially involved in the Australian Democrats, a political party founded, of course, by his father. Openly speaks about his history of addiction and drug use and how it impacted his perspectives on drug policy and law reform, has dedicated his career to developing Drug Policy Australia and spreading the message of drug law reform and the need for a health and human rights perspective to drug use. Please welcome Greg Chipp.
Thank you, Stan, and thank everybody for coming this evening and showing interest in what really is one of the most fundamental, emotive, divisive issues of our time, namely the war on drug users. I believe drug policy is one of the world's most significant social justice and human rights issues. Drug policy in Australia permanently harms young people, our families, and the very foundation of democratic society. The international prohibition and the criminalisation of people who use drugs was achieved by the United Nations through several international drug control treaties, beginning with the Single Convention on Narcotics in 1961. Never in the history of humanity has there been such a concerted effort to criminalise so many of our fellow human beings. According to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, 5.5% of the world's 8 billion people aged over 15 have used an illicit drug recently. So after 60 years of harsh enforcements, hundreds of billions of dollars spent or wasted, some would say, and this is staggering, over 440 million human beings, or almost 500 million people on this planet, have chosen to defy the law by using a banned drug. Let there be no mistake, the war on drugs is a war on people, most often waged on the hapless, the vulnerable, and the poor. Before I continue, I just want to share and talk about perhaps my personal journey and why I am passionate about this issue. Just talk briefly about Drug Policy Australia, and thank you, Stan, as he indicated there. I started Drug Policy Australia about 8 years ago as an advocacy-only charity. A lot of the AOD organisations here work at the coalface, and I tip my hat, and a lot of people like you helped me when I had my drug problems years ago. But Drug Policy Australia does the advocacy that the AOD organisations find difficult to do because they're reliant on government funding. We're a tax-deductible health promotion charity advocating that drug use should be treated as a health issue, not a criminal problem. In short, we campaign that there is a better way to manage the health consequences of drug use than criminalising people who use drugs. Now, I'd like to share my personal story. I remember a discussion with my father when I was 15 years old. It was like the discussion many parents have with their children about drugs, except one factor that I'll get to later. Let me paint a picture. I was a bookish kid, interested in politics and philosophy, and my father was a religious man. Not in the traditional sense, but he believed in God, in right and wrong, and in a good life. As a young person coming of age in the tail end of the 60s, I was interested in drugs. Dad, as a concerned father, was interested in me avoiding drugs. Dad's position was simple and eloquent, that life is so beautiful, so why should one blunt one's life's pleasures or sully the exquisite gift of life by being stoned? On the other hand, I argued that life was for living, and like most young people, I wanted to experience everything. I also put the case that it was my right to put in my own mind and body what I chose. And yes, that is a reference, for those that know, from John Stuart Mill's Libertarian Philosophies, which I read when I was 15. And I do believe the libertarian argument for drug reform is one of the lost planks of drug law reform. And I won't canvass the arguments here, but those that are familiar with works of John Stuart Mill would understand that there is an inalienable right to put into at least your mind and your body what you choose, not what a government or authority or your neighbours should want you to put in your mind or your body. As it transpires, I did not heed my father's advice. I stand here as one of the 9 million otherwise law-abiding Australians who have willfully defied the law by using an illicit substance during their lifetime. I'm one of the 36% of adults over the age of 14 in Australia who have used cannabis in their lifetime. I'm one of the 2 million Australians who have used cannabis in the last 12 months. I enjoyed cannabis almost daily for 40 years. This was not without consequences, including affecting my studies, but it was a choice I made freely and without regret. I've used psychedelic drugs sparingly, but with relish. My occasional use of LSD, mushrooms and ecstasy sometimes provided transformational experience of a personal spiritual significance. Other times it was just bloody good fun. I've also used narcotics, including heroin, cocaine and amphetamines. Although I enjoyed the pleasure and relief they offered, at other times I suffered addiction and despair through their abuse. The drug laws did not stop me becoming addicted to heroin, nor did the drug laws help me overcome my addiction, but instead were a cruel and unnecessary obstacle to my recovery. The best way of supporting recovery from a drug addiction is to treat addiction as a health issue. This can be achieved with compassion, love and empathy, particularly given what we now know about trauma and adverse childhood experience that are the driver of addictive behaviour. The love and support from family, particularly my father, was one of the things that ultimately led to my recovery. Tragically, the current punitive system does the exact opposite, resulting in those with problematic drug use to feel further disconnected, isolated, stigmatised and vilified. These feelings are the exact emotions that plunge human beings further down the rabbit hole of addiction. I'm among the hundreds of thousands of Australians who have been charged with drug offences over the last 60 years of Australia's drug prohibition. I'm unapologetic for my drug use. I'm one of the millions of Australians that say no to the laws that prohibit the use of psychoactive substances for pleasure. And I'm one of the millions of Australians that will never stop taking illicit substances simply because it's against the law. I raise these facts, not meaning to appear arrogant in defiance of the law, but to highlight to lawmakers that they must listen to people with lived experience of drugs. I speak on behalf of the disenfranchised who use drugs and will continue to use drugs regardless of the law. This is my message. Australia's war on people who use drugs is not only futile, but a source of untold suffering, persecution of vulnerable members of society, and the lifeblood of criminal networks needed to distribute illegal products. The current drug laws in Australia are unenforceable, and any attempt to enforce them causes more harm to society, personal misery than the drugs ever could. I certainly don't mean to encourage others to do as I have done, but urge lawmakers to appreciate that no government anywhere has ever succeeded in stopping citizens from taking drugs. 500 million people in the world are defying their governments and taking drugs. It's a bizarre aim and assumption that a government could do that. All governments have achieved with their drug laws is to greatly heighten the harm to society and increase the personal risks of taking drugs. My late father, Don Chipp, a federal minister for customs responsible for the national drug laws, was right when he said, "No government can stop young people from using drugs. That's a problem. That's the job of parents." The hard truth is that drug laws affect us all by putting our children at risk of losing their future through a criminal conviction, or even their life through a tainted batch of black market drugs. No authority on earth, no politician, police or parents has ever been able to stop young people from taking risks or taking drugs. The galling truth is that all the government can do is reduce the harm by making it safer when people inevitably do take drugs. I put this case on behalf of all Australians who have been persecuted, prosecuted, demeaned and vilified for their drug use, and for the many who have lost their freedoms pursuing an activity that should not be a crime. In hindsight, and with the wisdom of personal experience and age, I now concede that my father was right. Life is too short, too precious to squander on being stoned all day. But so was I right in the belief that the law that criminalises people for using a drug is counterproductive, ultimately doing more harm than the drugs themselves. In conclusion, I pose a question. Is there a better way? Thank you. Drug Policy Australia is a fully tax-deductible charity. If you'd like to help save our young people from the harms of prohibition, please visit the donation page on our website. Thank you.